I wish I could give you a hard copy. This is the only copy I have.
Everyone, welcome to this month's MLS Public Lecture Series. I'm really thrilled that we have with us my professor, Professor Francis Cody from University of Toronto. It's quite fortuitous that Frank's book, The News Event, came out yesterday. And we are probably the first one to be hosting a book talk. One of many, I'm hoping. Congratulations on the book, Frank, and welcome to MLS. For those of you who don't know a little bit about Frank, Professor Francis Cody is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Asian Institute at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on politics, language, and media in Southern India. His first book, The Light of Knowledge, Literacy Activism, and the Politics of Writing in South India, came out from Cornell in 2013, and it won the 2014 Edward Saville Book Prize awarded by the Society for Linguistic Anthropology. Frank's new book, The News Event, Popular Sovereignty in the Age of Deep Mediatization, has come out, as I said yesterday, from Chicago University Press 2023. It explores the questions of law, technology, and violence in the context of journalism and populist politics. The way we've planned it is we're going to have Frank speak a little bit about his book for around 20 minutes, and then we have my colleague, Dr. Karthik Ram Manoharan, who's going to come in and reflect for about 10 minutes, and some provocations, etc. If you want, you can come in and maybe respond, and then we open it up for a question and answer round. Yeah, thanks so much. Over to you.
Is there a particular mic I should use? I'll use this one. We know this one works. Hello?
Yes.
All right. Thanks so much for this opportunity to share this book with you. Thanks to the National Law School, to Anwesha Ghosh, and especially to Karthik for the opportunity to engage with this work. This book owes a lot to intellectual traditions that I think have their root here at the National Law School, looking at the intersection between society and law. Literary approaches to legal thought have been a big influence on me. And so some of the chapters here are kind of a direct response to intellectual traditions that have really deep roots here at the law school. And so I appreciate this as the place where I will first introduce the book to people. What I'll do is maybe read a little bit from the introduction, but also just talk about it. Yeah, I'll read a little bit from the intro and then talk about aspects of the book, like what are the big questions, that type of thing. And then we can go more into stuff in question and answer period. So I'll start from the beginning. They're gonna kill me, they're gonna kill me, yelled the elderly man in Tamil as the police dragged him forcefully from his bed. It was the middle of the night. M. Karunanidhi, one of the most recognizable faces in Indian politics, was arrested over allegations of corruption in his house in Chennai. It was 1:45 a.m. on June 30th, 2001. Shaky flashlight-lit footage of the frail 78-year-old patriarch of the Tamil nationalist movement getting roughed up, and the sounds of his hoarse screaming are etched into Tamil Nadu's collective memory. I was shocked seeing the 1-minute news clip on television that morning. I imagine these images must have affected anyone who happened to watch national news programs in the rest of India that day. Everyone knew that the Chennai city police were executing the commands of Karunanidhi's bitter rival, the newly re-elected Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, J. Jayalalitha. She had been jailed for a month on charges of corruption a few years earlier, under Karunanidhi's rule. In her estimation, the time for revenge had arrived. A triumphant Jayalalitha was pictured in the daily press soon after the arrest, gifting an elephant to the famous Guruvayur Sri Krishna temple in gratitude for her party's majority in the state assembly elections. Jayalalitha's victory was short-lived, however. She did not anticipate that a young cameraman by the name of Madi from Sun TV News would be on the scene of the arrest. More importantly, the chief minister appeared to have miscalculated how shows of sovereignty work in the then newly emerging media environment of 24-hour news broadcasts. Footage of police brutality against the aging leader had been playing on a constant loop on Sun TV throughout the morning following the midnight arrest, as it had come to be known. I was studying Tamil in preparation for my dissertation research in the southern city of Madurai at the time. Every household I visited was glued to the screen all day long. Those who didn't have televisions at home gathered in front of neighborhood tea stalls that did, staring in disbelief. My language classes had been canceled and stores were shuttered in anticipation of violence across the state. By afternoon, the repetition of Karunanidhi's arrest sequence was interspersed with scenes of crowds taking to the streets to vent their anger at the vengeful arrogance of the state's new leader. The press, meanwhile, inevitably invoked comparisons with Indira Gandhi's authoritarian declaration of a state of emergency across India 26 years earlier. The television news station that had captured and broadcasted this image of personalized state violence was, in fact, founded just 1 year earlier by Karunanidhi's own grandnephew. Sun TV News had become the most watched news channel in the state. It was closely associated in everyone's mind with Karunanidhi's political party, the DMK, even sharing the party's iconic logo depicting a rising sun. While Jayalalitha's own party channel, Jaya TV, did its utmost to provide a counter-framing of the event as a response to a corrupt political family obstructing justice, they failed to control the public narrative for any but Jayalalitha's most ardent followers, those who would only come to admire her strength of will more than ever, as the arrest turned into a polarizing political spectacle. By the evening of July 1st, the moving image captured by Sun TV News had spread beyond the state of Tamil Nadu to the whole country of India and done its crucial work. Public discontent with Jayalalitha's actions before television screens and in the streets of Tamil Nadu had refracted into a confrontation with the central government of India in Delhi. The ruling BJP government, which was in an alliance with the DMK at the time, forced the governor of Tamil Nadu to resign for lack of independent oversight and sent a delegation from the Home Ministry to Chennai. Those were different times. Charges were then dropped against 2 DMK ministers who had also been arrested the following day after they refused to accept an offer of bail. Karunanidhi remained in judicial custody for 5 days, also rejecting bail, during which time judges found no evidence against him. In an effort to rescue her claim to sovereignty under such compromised conditions, Jayalalitha asserted it was she who had released Karunanidhi on, quote, purely humanitarian grounds, considering his advanced age. In the words of an editorial titled "The Midnight Knocked That Boomerang," published in India's newspaper of record, The Hindu, quote, the hunter had become the hunted. The chief minister's efforts to assert her image as a powerful leader of the Tamil people had been turned against her in the judo-like combat sport that is political publicity in the age of deep mediatization. So we all understand that when news events happen and they're represented, news media represents events happening in the world, but the event of representation itself can cause a change in the situation. Many well-known examples of this abound in the mythology around journalism. In the United States, people point to the Watergate scandal as an important factor taking Richard Nixon down as president. In India, the Beaufort scandal was a very damaging moment for the Congress Party, broken by the Hindu and other newspapers. We could think of Jayalalitha's arrest as something similar, although the medium of television makes it a little different. But it did certainly cost her politically. She lost the following elections, and she lost a lot of political clout, I would say, at a national level as well. So text and images certainly do things under the right conditions. But I think this model of news as disclosure sometimes obscures many aspects of how news events are actually produced. And so this book is about that relationship between disclosure and performance in news events. The performativity of news works both directions. So acts of circulating information in public can invite people to act in a particular way in front of the news, of course. We're all familiar with the idea of a media event, an event that's been staged in anticipation of news coverage. We can even surmise that Karunanidhi was screaming in part for the television cameras without at all diminishing the cruelty of the attack, right? So leaks, misinformation, manufactured crises, these are common political tactics that we're very familiar with. And journalism might incite actions from those subjects it represents, as well as from consumers of the news. And that's the type of news event that this book looks at. Journalists and institutions of news productions are very important. They're a way for society to objectify itself, to think critically about itself and about the state. But they are deeply conditioned by milieux of technology, capital, and law, shaping their contribution to the field of politics. And so this constantly changing ecology of forces encourages dynamics of performativity, and especially the emergence of feedback loops that are more complicated than the model of news as disclosure might suggest. I think now in the age of digital media and its network effects more than ever before. But one of the arguments in this book is that a lot of those aspects of sort of feedback loops and performing for news cameras that we associated with digital media has a longer history. And so the book does look back at nearly 20 years of news events in the Tamil context in order to understand how certain dynamics that are built into the feature of how news is shaped by what some scholars call communicative capitalism. That is the way in which capitalism extracts value through circulation alone, have intensified in recent years through digital media, but the seeds of which were already there. And we've just become much more aware of that. And so that's one of the major themes of the book. So I'm interested, the concept of the news event is really about that moment where it becomes difficult to disentangle the event of news representation from the event being represented in the news, right? So that's the kind of concept I developed through a bunch of different cases. So, public concerns about the role of journalism in shaping politics are very old. In the United States, we have this lore that the Spanish-American War was started by a false report about a bombing of a US ship in Cuba. But the anxieties we have about it have sharpened, I believe, especially in the age of misinformation. And so part of the story that I tell in the book is also about the transformations in politics in Tamil Nadu over the past few decades of technological upheaval, as we've shifted from a world of print and a broadcast-based satellite media to digital networks, the rise of WhatsApp and things like that. 20 years ago, going back to our opening scene, in an age when privately owned cable news television was brand new to India, right? We're talking about 2001. Most reporting in the press on the midnight arrest of Karunanidhi gave as much importance to Sun TV's brutal images of the event, making the arrest a political problem it did for Jayalalitha, as it did on the legal dimensions of the arrest itself. Television was already an integral part of the story of the event. It had become difficult to disentangle the motives and effects of media coverage from the broader politics of the event. Sun TV news editor at the time of Karunanidhi's arrest, A.S. Paneerselvan, told me he was proud of his team's, quote, sharp critical journalism. And he was trying to invoke this kind of professional distance that journalists are supposed to inhabit from the event. But then he did admit, of course, that the event coverage certainly resonated with people. Others found fault with the looping footage, calling it a form of party propaganda that played on viewers' emotions while dodging the deeper question of political corruption. The Chennai Police Commissioner, for his part, sought an injunction against Sun TV for telecasting objectionable material. Reporters from the station were harassed by police in the days following the arrest. In response to critics, the editor, Panir Selvan, argued that Sun TV coverage played a relatively minor role in Jayalalitha's subsequent misfortunes. But many in the industry and beyond remember the recorded arrest as a new type of media event that forever altered the contours of Tamil politics. Debates on the role of media technologies in representing reality, provoking violence, modulating affect, and mediating politics have intensified since, even while we're becoming more aware than ever of the fact that it was never the case that journalists simply reported the world out there from a safe distance. I would say this is especially the case in Indian news and Tamil news, where everyone knows kind of the political angle that different people are taking based on the ownership of the channel or the newspaper. The rapid layering of new media technologies that has occurred over the last 2 decades has come to play a defining role in what counts as news. Now, in an age of digital media that raises more profound questions about who or what really controls the circulation of information, distinctions between the event of representation and the events being represented in the news have become more problematic than ever. And so various media theorists have come up with ways to try to understand this. Ravi Sundaram has a concept of the circulation engine, which is similar to the concept of communicative capitalism that Jodi Dean, who's a political theorist, develops in her critique of sort of neoliberal dreams of transparency. Another thinker who's important in this field is the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler. He's a philosopher of technology, very influential in media studies. And he has this concept of eventization, to talk about this collapse between the storyline and that which it is reporting on. And he sees this kind of proliferation of eventization as part of this shift towards industrialization of what he calls external memory machines. That is our mass media. As they become more and more industrialized, it's harder to disentangle a historical event from the fact of its reporting. And historical events are increasingly geared towards the fact of their reporting. And for thinkers like Stiegler or Dean, this generally leads to what Jodi Dean would call sort of a tendency away from politics, because circulation on its own terms becomes more important than the thing that's being represented in the media. I find this argument a little difficult. It's kind of a recapitulation of older Frankfurt School Marxist arguments about the culture industry, but now revamped for the digital age. And I find it difficult to, for me to disentangle real politics from the politics of news representation. When, in a place like Tamil Nadu, but it's not unique in this respect, I think it was advanced in Indian terms, when politics has been mediatized from the beginning of mass politics, right? I mean, of course, in Tamil Nadu, we have this history of not only film being a very important vehicle for politics in the Dravidian movement and after, but also the degree to which every political person was also a newspaper person for a long time in Tamil Nadu. And so to separate politics from the business of news media is a bit difficult to do. And so I reject the assumption that life is becoming somehow less political as we become more mediatized in our understanding of events in the world. But then it raises the questions of what kind of politics are possible and what kind of politics do arise in a condition where so many people are acting under the assumption that they're being recorded at that moment of action. And that recording is going to be what's important. As it circulates, of course, in broadcast news, but as we know, a great deal of broadcast news these days is actually reporting on things that are circulating on WhatsApp, for example, or evidence that's been captured about state malfeasance from a photograph taken from a cell phone. So that's the type of stuff I look into later in the book. I want to just briefly talk about the question of law here, since I'm at the law school, and there is some work on law and media in this book, and then a little bit about methods, and then I will wrap up. So news gathering has always been both a vocation and a business. But the law emerges in this study as a very explosive site for the production of news events, precisely because its foundations are more firmly rooted in a set of principles that cannot be reduced to economic rationalities of commodification. There's something about the law that claims transcendence of commodification. The law has long claimed for itself a majesty that sits above the fray of commercial life, embodied in the sartorial and architectural regalia of the courts, and not only in its normative judgments. Indeed, scholars drawing on feminist legal theory like Pratiksha Bakshi have suggested that we move beyond legal doctrine to understand law's legitimacy and pay attention to the court as a, quote, site of theater and ritual. Statutes on libel, sedition, and contempt are used to regulate media content and distribution to maintain the oratic power of legal ritual and the state itself by defining the contours of what can be said and shown in public according to normative commitments that are meant to be independent of market logics. In some important respects, like the news media, law too is invested in drawing a distinction between the sphere of autonomous observation and judgment on the one hand and the larger media environment in which it operates on the other. People are constantly trying to shield their statements as somehow outside what they're describing, to have that exteriority that is required of law, and that journalists would also like to claim, but find it very difficult to claim. At the same time, this dividing line is constantly breached. Law regulates media, but images of the law also form a great deal of contemporary media content. For example, in dramatic form on television and in films, but especially in journalism, where legal reporting makes up a very significant proportion of the daily news. Recognizing this fact, critical legal theorists have urged scholarship to attend more rigorously to the, quote, remediation of law from text to digital images and from the gravitas of text and library, scripture, chambers, and court to the internet and to entertainment. This is Peter Goodrich I'm quoting. The law is in fact known to the public and acts in part through such images. And this tells us about its power in the world beyond the legal brief and the courtroom, as well as its vulnerability to the politics of media representation. And vulnerability to representation is a constant theme in this book, and judges, like political leaders, are very touchy about how they're being represented in the media. Judges representing the law are deeply invested in publicity and being shown to act in the public interest, while their discourse and image are subjects to the vicissitudes of public uptake. The interplay between these aspects of mediation, how the law shapes media, how the law is depicted in the media, and how these remediations feed off each other, has recently become the subject of serious analysis. Law as prohibition can become a major vector of communicability. And one of the things I look at in great depth is defamation law and how that becomes a medium of publicity for some people who are accused of defamation. Of course, we're seeing that play out at the national level right now. Attempts to repress the circulation of information might well attract attention, spurring new waves of publicity. Courtrooms easily serve as stages on which not only social norms, but also the law itself are debated before a news-consuming public, at once democratizing and vulgarizing the juridical field. The ban on cameras in the courtroom could be read as an index of the danger publicity poses to the majesty of law in this context, while heightening the mystery value of the courtroom space. Claiming a great deal of space in newspapers and on television, legal reporting nevertheless provides raw material for the engines of communicative capitalism, all while being subject to different juridical limits from other forms of journalism in the interest of maintaining the aristocratic aura of legal institutions. So in addition to defamation, I look at legal reporting and contempt of court, threats of contempt of court that are brought to journalists because of how they depicted a particular judgment, and the role of obiter dicta in judgments as actually providing the message that judges wanted to get out in public beyond the actual decision, which is something that legal scholars who've gone to this university have written about. The book also looks at celebrity outlaws. One of the most famous from Tamil Nadu is Veerappan, part of a contentious relationship with the state of Karnataka, but also more recently caste vigilantes who've become famous for murdering people, who've become important people in the news and talk to reporters and so forth. And then the final chapter is about what we might call citizen journalism. The fact that so many of the protest movements that broke out in Tamil Nadu after the death of Jayalalitha had to do with incendiary documentation that came from cell phones, the circulation of information that then becomes news that gets reported in broadcast media and in newspapers, and that were enabling forms of political mobilization that were often understood to be leaderless. That there are different interpretations of that, but that could spread with a speed that was previously unknown and was thought to have a vitality that was quite different from party organized protests, for example. This idea of a self-organizing crowd and the role of news and mass media in that is something I look at in some depth in the last chapter. I think I've probably spoken enough. I mean, there's a section on methods that I wanted to get into a little bit, because studying news events, I'm an anthropologist by training, and we generally hang out with people and interview them and just kind of see how they experience the world. It's our method. It's not always very rigorous, but it is. It's a very weird way to study news events, because news events are something that happen across space and time in a way that's difficult to get a grasp on from an ethnographic perspective. And so while there's been a lot of very interesting thought about anthropological approaches to the event, Veena Das wrote a very important book in the mid-90s called Critical Events, where she asked the question of how would an anthropologist approach these events of national importance, because they throw up new questions about how we understand kinship, religion, community, big questions that anthropologists are interested in, but they're not used to thinking on that scale. I think the news event is an interesting way to kind of pick up a thread that Veena Das had left for us in that work. And that's something I do, because many people who focus on the event focus really on the everyday and everyday interactions, which Veena Das herself has the direction she's gone in her research. But I think media studies could use this kind of ethnographic approach to think about large-scale events as they're reinterpreted by news media, and as then consumers of news play a role in the production of news increasingly in the digital era. And so I do make a pitch for an anthropology of the news events using the methods that we've developed in anthropology, but also cultural studies and a lot of other disciplines, critical legal studies. So I think I've probably spoken enough about the book, and I'm going to now turn it over to our colleague, Karthik Manoharan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frank, for this, for being here, first of all. And we are really delighted that we are the institution which is hosting the first discussion of your book. So a round of applause for my good friend, Frank. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So this is really a remarkable book, though Frank used some really high-sounding terminology towards the end and scared you with some phrases. It's a very easy read, right? And I don't mean this in a...
No, that's right. Take it as a compliment.
Because I am a complete stranger to anthropology, ethnography, and all those sort of terms. But from the start till the end, this book was a gripping read. So I'll just tell you some of the subjects which are covered in this book. It covers the issue of an award-winning and internationally known novelist called Perumal Murugan, whose novel has now been longlisted for the Booker Prize. Yes, it covers a controversial and a very adventurous journalist called Nakiran Gopal. It discusses a bandit, a social bandit called Veerappan. It covers a casteist vigilante. It covers a juicy interfaith affair and how it was dealt by the Madras High Court. And it covers a major police atrocity which happened in 2006. When did that happen?
Which major one?
The Thoothukudi firing.
Thoothukudi was more recent. That was 2017.
2017, which happened in 2017 and much more. For those who are familiar with Tamil politics and those who are in Tamil Nadu, you might be, when reading these passages, you might recount these images which might have come across in your everyday television screen. For those who are not from Tamil Nadu, they do conjure up vivid scenarios because Frank is a really good actor. Okay, so now on to your book. News event of 2001 for many in Tamil Nadu was the arrest of M. Karunanidhi, the leader of the DMK, allegedly on corruption charges, right, which was conducted by the police under the ruling regime of Jayalalitha. 2001 was also a very major year as regards to news events because another major event happened in that year, 9/11. And the images of 9/11 marked and continue to mark American politics, and they do continue to polarize discourse in America till date, I would say. Yes. Did the news event of Tamil Nadu have such a similar impact? It definitely did when it happened. It definitely also did in the elections that soon happened after, because the Sun TV, the news channel which was very sympathetic towards the DMK, constantly reminded that this atrocity took place under Jayalalitha's regime. How this had complete disregard for a veteran leader of Tamil politics and for any sort of democratic procedure or civility. Right? But over the period of time, right, after rule again alternated between DMK and ADM, the image of Karunanidhi being arrested ceased to have that sort of an emotive power on the Tamil public's imagination, and they quickly shifted to other things. In fact, I would say, at least from what I monitor, what I see on social media, that image of Karunanidhi being arrested is used derisively by some of the more extreme opponents of DMK to mock this leader's performance. They say that this was a drama conducted by Karunanidhi to gain sympathy for himself. Most notably, the Tamil nationalists do this often. So, one of the key thesis of this book, if I'm right, is that news event is a process where the news itself turns into an event, right? So my reading of event comes quite differently. So it comes from this Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who reads event as a certain incident in history which radically changes how public discourse is made, right? So, for instance, the French Revolution, right? After the French Revolution, it was no longer possible to talk about rights in France as it was in pre-revolutionary times, right? So we can have many such events. In Tamil Nadu, at least in my research, I have identified the publication of the non-Brahmin manifesto as such an event, because after that, the political categories of Brahmin and non-Brahmin became deeply implanted in the public imagination for such a long time. So, if we were to take that sort of a perspective, would we read news events as moments, as sensations? Because I ask this because do all news events have a permanent character, or are they only transient? Are they momentary, and are they also shaped by certain other sort of factors? You have addressed that in your book, but I would like you to expand on it a bit more. Right? So, I also want to understand or perhaps explore a bit more on what does make a news event and why do some incidents generate the sort of impact which is not accorded to other incidents, maybe of similar or greater intensity. Right? So, for instance, there was this Kilvain Mani massacre in the state of Tamil Nadu. For those of you who don't know, Kilvain Mani massacre happened in December 1968. In this massacre, landlord affiliated with the Congress party, Gopal Krishna Naidu, massacred 44 scheduled caste laborers in the village of in the town of Kilvain Mani, located in the district of Tanjore, right? Now, though the perpetrator was a congressman and though the victims were scheduled castes, this event gained notoriety because it happened under the very first DMK regime. Now, the DMK rode into power on the promise of social justice, on the promise of equality, being opposed to caste and all that. But still, this event happened. And in contemporary Dalit discourse, it is highlighted as a very key failing of the DMK government. Now, you might assume that this had a huge significance among public conscience at that point of time. But surprisingly, when you go through media records, the response was very muted, including by critics of the DMK, right? So the Hindu, which was one of, which at that point of time in the 60s was a very strong critic of the DMK from the left perspective, had a very sort of a toned down and balanced editorial where they alleged that both extremists in the labor side and among the landlord side were responsible for this massacre to happen. The Times of India, again a conservative critique of the DMK government, had no coverage of the event at all. It is only much later, after a certain discourse of Dalit consciousness started getting popular, that Kilvin started becoming reimagined as a momentous event. So, can events be reconstructed after the 15 minutes of fame have passed, after they have not been considered as newsworthy or eventful in their own lifetime? So, another thing which I wanted to refer to was another image, namely which supposedly had some impact, namely the image of the slain LPD leader Prabhakar, right? So when this war in Sri Lanka was coming to an end, it was assumed that if the leadership dies or something, there would be a massive counter response in government. But again, the response, yes, there were protests and all that, but they were largely muted, right? As in, there wasn't anything significant enough to challenge the government or pose a security threat or anything. If anything, many of the supporters of the LTTE cause were in denial. They were like, like this title of this Hindi movie says, Tiger Zinda Hai. They believe that he's still alive and they continue to insist that he's alive. So they are in denial of what potentially could have been a news event and what image could have possibly shaped a sort of a discourse in Tamil politics. So I am just wondering how do these operations take place in your reading of the news? And also regarding this caste leader, Yuvraj, right? I mean, there's an issue which you raise about platforming and no platform, right? I'm putting it very clearly, right, in academic parlance, right? So Yuvraj was this leader of this caste outfit, and he was held responsible for the murder of a Dalit youth, whom he suspected of being in a relationship with a girl from the same caste, right? Now, as Cody, very sort of poignant, as Frank, sorry, I keep referring to you as Cody.
It's a common first name.
No, because your second name is a lot more accessible than your first name, So anyway, so as Frank so very, very poignantly notes in his book, the sort of space which was given to Yuvraj in the media and in certain YouTube channels made him into a sort of a local hero, right? Of his caste outfit who was willing to put his life on the line to defend the community's honor and so on. And there is a question of the media ethics in giving space to such a personality, right? Now, what particularly struck me, and I'm just being provocative over here, what particularly struck me was the Hindus' denial to give this fellow a new space, right? So they told that, apparently this chap wanted to be covered by the Hindu, and the Hindu told that we don't do this sort of things, right? But then again, just a few years back, the Hindu gave a front page coverage to Mahinda Rajapaksa, right? Soon after 2009, and not just that, the editor went on paper to say that whatever Rajapaksa is saying is true, wrong, right? So I'm just wondering whether this sort of platforming, which happens in media, right? It happens at a certain level in the English media and at a different level in Tamil media. Is it perhaps because they rely on certain markets and certain sentiments, which they cannot afford to easily? Right? So if Pudiya Talamurai and the other channel, I forgot the channel.
Tandi TV.
Tandi TV. If Pudiya Talamurai and Tandi TV chose to ignore Yuvraj, right? And if Rangaraj Pandey chose not to interview Yuvraj, right? Wouldn't that have, to some extent, affected their ability to create news events first? Right? The ability of these channels to create news events. And finally, I guess the recent YouTube sensations and the citizen journalism is indeed posing a sort of a credible challenge to established media houses to some extent, yes, definitely. But then there is this complete sort of plurality of narratives that it really becomes impossible to filter out and pick one, right? So pretty much every party, just as at one point of time you noticed that many DMK leaders ran newspapers of their own until Karunanidhi monopolized everything and brought it under Mercer, right? But at the moment, different political parties have their first rung, second rung, third rung leaders all having YouTube channels of their own, often conveying narratives which can be quite contradictory to each other as well. I mean, I follow the videos of the Tamil Nationalist Party, Nam Tamil SC, for research interests, and I know that there is completely no coherence in their sort of narration of what does it mean to be Tamil, who's an outsider, who's an enemy, what are the primary issues confronting Tamil Nadu, and so on. So, does the emergence of these sort of plurality of channels, in a way, dilute the impact of the news? Or does it amplify it in ways we cannot imagine? So, that's all. Thank you. Thank you. Did it take too much time?
Thank you so much. There are many questions here that I'll try to group some and respond a little bit before opening it up. I really appreciate the care with which you read it and the way in which you're projecting these questions into the present. And so this is a lot of it is what I'm thinking about right now as a researcher, especially the proliferation of YouTube channels and questions of denial. So let me, I think, go to the broadest question, which is what is an event, which is something I lay out in some detail in the methods section in the introduction. And I'm precisely using the term in a way that's quite different from the way it's been used largely in the political, theoretical, philosophical tradition that Zizek is engaged with, but is commonly associated also with Badiou. Which insists on understanding the event as a rupture, total break with that which became before of world historical significance, right? And it's no accident that you mentioned the French Revolution, because that's the kind of template, right? That these philosophers generally turn to as that's the event. Everything else is kind of, in some senses, completing it or replaying it, or that is like a decisive moment in political history. That has grounded European thought. I'm moving away precisely from this approach to the event, and that's I would think about it as the event with a big E. And these philosophers, especially Badiou, is very explicit about its relationship to the Christian tradition of the Messiah and so forth. That's not what is of interest to me in this book. And you're right, the events I write about are not events that are going to change world history. There is both an analytical reason, I'm not looking at that type of event, but there's also kind of an ethics behind it that I think comes out of the discipline of anthropology. It comes out of recent moves to kind of decenter European history as the history of the world that I'm quite committed to. And so I'm looking at events with a small and events as something that we can approach from a more phenomenological perspective, as that which appears to break with that which goes without saying. And that can be manufactured. Events are manufactured. It can be often it's a conjunction of contingency and artifice. The arrest of Karandi is an interesting case in that sense, because there was some sense of advanced planning, because clearly people knew something was going to happen, such that there was a camera person at the event. But there's a lot of contingency involved. And you're absolutely right to note that this became a sort of a short-term problem for Jayuta, but not a long-term one. I would argue that it was eventful in a different way, not in terms of defining the political fortunes of the parties and the personages involved, but in redefining the field of politics. It was eventful. There's kind of before the arrest and after, if you look at it from a kind of media politics perspective. So in that sense, it was quite eventful, more so than most of the stuff I write about in the book, which many people had forgotten about, which was sensational when it happened. But then the next week you're onto something else. As well, we're used to this kind of constant barrage of events, which is the lifeblood of this kind of orientation towards communicative capitalism, which is just about circulating information. It's not about you reporting something and you actually expect a change to happen in the world. You're after eyeballs, you're after a spectacle, right? And in that sense, I'm recapitulating a theme that has old roots going back to Baudrillard and the situationists and stuff like that, talking about the society of the spectacle. I think what they were worried about in the 1960s and 70s is something we all worry about a lot now. And I'm trying to sort of attend to that worry through empirical cases that show us how it plays out. And so in that sense, that's why I approach the event as this kind of process. I'm interested in eventization. How do people make things into an event, right? And so in that sense, it's not an event with the big E. It's not the Zizek event. I'm looking at something quite different. And I'm very clear about that. But then when you get to events that should have been earth-shattering and in retrospect were, Cuban money is a great example, but at the time weren't, right? And you see this a lot in the history of reporting on caste atrocity in India, things that should be a much bigger deal than they are. There's many forces that lead political leaders, that lead journalists, even though they do have the potential to have a big story, to tone it down. And this has to do with the dynamic you were talking about when looking at the putting Yuvraj platforming, right? Yeah. People know who their readers are, their advertisers, and so there are a lot of forces that lead people not to make something into an event that should have been an event, and that now we look back historically was a kind of turning point in politics in the Delta, for sure, but also I think in how the Tamil polity was having to kind of confront the issue of caste and labor mobilization. And of course, that's an event that gets used for various ends, and there's competition between the left and the Dalit movement over who can claim the event. And it's in fact, I think it's in some respects more important than the DMK because they had recently come to power. Anyway, so the role of reconstruction is very important here. And this kind of lies outside some of the stuff that I write in the book, but I think it's a very important thing that happens through a very different genre of journalism. And it is Maitri Shivaraman, and like that type of someone meticulously documents it, goes back months later and creates an archive. That's how something like Cuban money becomes Cuban money. Then people write books about it, documentary films. There's a whole slew of Tamil novels about it. That's how it became the defining event. So that's something that's a bit outside the purview of what I'm studying because I'm people who are like addicted to the present. Yeah. And that's why, for good reason, political theorists are worried that this addiction to circulation in the present is a depoliticizing, it has depoliticizing tendencies. At the same time, that very addiction allows for very explosive events to happen. Jallikattu protests on Marina Beach on a scale that blows the mind, even when looking back at it. Not a turning point in Tamil politics in many respects, marking a sort of a claim to sovereignty that had been muffled by a party system that was not allowing the articulation. So markets play a huge role, and people are very attuned to what in the long term is going to hurt them, and are willing to take short-term losses in order to keep a certain market segment. And the Hindu, I mean, you can analyze any number of organizations through that lens in order to understand some of the decisions they make. At the same time, and this is something I'm learning more and more after in the research I've been conducting since I've written this book, you have to pay a great deal of attention to the actual personalities involved. And here's where individual editors and journalists matter. The fact that Rajapaksa was a star in the Hindu had a lot to do with Mr. Ram's proclivities politically. It was not the Hindu stance. It was certainly not the Tamil reading public stance. And I mean, the same could be said of different aspects of global reporting that were happening under his editorship. But by the same token, a lot of the most interesting reporting on things that would not have been events had it not been for some journalists who went out there and actually asked people what happened, that become events have to do with the proclivities of individual journalists, many of them very young people who are trying to make a name for themselves. And something scales up very quickly because they're willing to take a certain risk. And sometimes it's a risk that appears unethical, right? I mean, I think the Yuvraj interviews, I mean, you'll have to read the book to see how it unfolds, because it's a somewhat complicated story, but this caste leader who had allegedly at the time murdered someone, who was subsequently convicted, had not been caught by the police for 3 months, and he was being interviewed on television channels, right? So the question arises: how are television channels able to get in touch with this person, but the police aren't? And part of the ethical argument that the television channels were making at the time was that, look, we're showing you how incompetent or unwilling the police are to find this murderer. At the same time, they were giving him a platform. And so it was a really sticky issue that was divisive in the journalistic community. And in many respects, unfortunate, because it was the event of his becoming a well-known, for the moment, celebrity, and people forgot about him afterwards, that overshadowed the murder that he did. And I think this is a very dangerous thing that happens when, and there's a whole chapter on celebrity outlaws, when someone becomes known for violence. With regards to the proliferation of YouTube channels and the role of plurality, that's a constantly evolving story. I mean, there was a plurality of television channels in the time that I was, we moved from 2 television channels essentially to, I can't count them, it keeps changing, but over the course of writing this book, it went from 2 to 20 very quickly in Tamil. Did that plurality change very much? In some respects, yes, because you had the first time that channels could make the claim, whether you want to accept it or not, that they were not affiliated with a particular party, which led to this experiment with this idea of independent journalism, which for good reason people are very suspicious of, because there's usually an angle. And in some respects, that independence is much more under danger because they're corporate houses. And so political parties are actually more able to get at independent corporates than they are at other political parties. And so for a well-known journalist like Gunasekharan, it became more important to become at a station where he had protection, because he was working at News 18, which was owned by Bani. So plurality doesn't lead to an amplification of views necessarily. It leads to more noise oftentimes. And I think the YouTube plurality is different than the broadcasting plurality because it costs very little to do a new YouTube channel. And so you're getting some interesting, but a lot of it is commentary and a lot of it is paid for, as the old news was. And so it's hard to tell. we're in early days yet of the YouTube news thing to prognosticate. But I think a lot of the same questions that were being asked of the pluralization of broadcast news can be asked of YouTube. It's not quite as radical as it appears just because of the difference of format.
Questions?
May I go first? And shall we collect a couple of questions and then?
Sure.
So
yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned what I see as, moving away from like a curation of memory archives. I'm a historian. I read Vinadas we used till the 90s to say memory is very slippery and it's very difficult to put together and you don't have access to a lot of sources and it will remain proscribed for the longest time, etc. And while I understand that you're speaking about popular sovereignty and being consumers of different kinds of news events, etc., we're also at the and not just at the receiving end, but we're also producing, we're content creators at this point. And I feel that turn is coming with what you call new mediatization, right? And I was wondering how you would move, maybe not move, but engage with, the anthropology of memory. Because while you're talking about people are just stuck on something, it's a spectacle for 15 minutes of fame and then you move on.
Yes.
The other end of it is also that the internet never forgets. And these screenshots that would be buried and then dug up after a decade and could still cause a flurry for maybe weeks on end, or could actually topple things and the status quo. And I was wondering, we do hold a certain kind of, I don't know, but do we hold a certain kind of, control over, the smartphones, which is recording anything that is happening. So you don't wait for the media to arrive, and you can create your own content and put it up there, etc. And I was wondering, what does that do to the anthropology of memory on the side?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Should we circulate two mics?
Yeah.
You were talking about you mentioned the situation of Sanjeev, the words, the society of the spectacle, and clearly the event is some sort of spectacle, but it's also different. The mediatized event is different from the spectacle that one imagines in the anthropological canon on performative events, which would be a public speech or something like that, which is something the real, quote unquote, real world. How do you see the two as different, and how do they? What is the mediatized event is a reified version of the other, or is there any other way to look at it? Secondly, you were talking. I was very taken by your phrase "connection to the present," and it says something about the bracketed time of the event, and which is neither present nor future. It's bracketed, it's frozen, and that's what the screenshot kind of economy gives us. Can you speak a little bit about the time of the event?
Hi, I was wondering what you think about this notion of a turning point within this entire idea of a news event. I've come across multiple places, multiple TV debates or news events which are brought. This was the particular turning point. I'm wondering how that fits into anthropological work.
Good evening, Professor. Sorry, congratulations on your book. So this was the one line that was mentioned in the abstract that we received, and that said that public sovereignty is thoroughly mediated by the production of news.
Yes.
So I basically wanted to compare and contrast two events that have happened in two democracies, that is US and India. So this BBC documentary that came out of the Prime Minister, and people wanted there was like division of groups. People wanted to see that there was the demand of seeing that, but yes, we were denied the access to it. Something that probably should have been there for open deliberation and for open viewing was curtailed. On the other hand, today you have the criminal charges against the former US president, and he's facing those charges. The trial is going on. The media is covering it, that people are able to see that. Probably that is one event where that curtailment should have happened to protect because of his position or because of the power that he held. So from that angle. So basically my question comes from the point of view of state authority. So here state authority will exercise in a different way. There it could have been exercised, but it is not being done that way. So it is open for the people to understand and think about it. So I just wanted to compare and contrast this. How does state figure in this entirety?
I have a lot of questions now.
Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I respond a little bit?
Please,
Yeah.
please.
Okay. So on the anthropology of memory, this work was provoked in some respects by philosophical reflections on memory. I mentioned that philosopher Stigler, who thinks about media as exteriorized memory devices. And then you have to pay attention to the capacities and affordances and propensities of those media for the transmission of memory. And in some respects, that something on the internet never dies. In many respects, sure, all sorts of stuff is gone, right? I mean, this is one of the dangers of digital archive projects, because a lot of stuff that people thought, oh, it's on the net, so it's safe, it's disappeared, right? And a lot of people thought, oh, there's no record of it. Well, suddenly it appears. And so in that respect, the internet is not completely unlike older politics of memory, where documents from a long time ago will appear from nowhere and so forth. The difference goes to the kind of question that I think Theyre was asking about, the kind of temporality of experience, of like what counts as worth remembering. And that is a big question. Because on the one hand, you have the proliferation of externalized memories that we can all just put up on YouTube. At the same time, the value of those memories is determined largely by their capacity to be liked and shared by other people and so forth, right? There are many things you keep in an archive that you value, that the value is independent of the number of people who go to see it, right? I think to the degree to which things are placed in platforms, the economic model of which is maximum circulation, are going to have a different kind of valuation than things that are, and that's why digital archiving is a very tricky thing, which I know very little about. But I do work with people for whom there's this rush to digitize everything because that's how it's going to be saved, because of the terrible state of our libraries and so forth, is something you hear a lot. But digital curation is a very tricky thing, precisely because the digital sphere is so determined by technologies that have been developed for circulation, not for preservation. So I think there's a whole way in which the anthropology of memory is going to have to engage with media and archive studies to think about that question. That I have not gone down that path very far, so it's a really great question that I wish I could answer better. So the time of the event as the present, it's a present, but it is, there are these recurring pasts, there are these images that continue to come back and haunt. The fact that I wasn't quite aware, I mean, I've seen it recirculated, but the images of the arrest of Karanandi are now used somehow as,
That is simple.
it's used as a kind of emasculating type thing, yeah. When at the time that image was used precisely to defang the DMK's enemies, right? It's the recontextualization of an image in a new political sphere within a new rhetorical frame is going to give it a power that it just didn't have before. And so I think, you know, I say we're addicted to the present, but that present includes obfuscated pasts, you know, conspiracy theories about what happened. It includes paper documents have not gone away. We thought they would all just disappear, right? And yet we still always have to take a picture of some paper document in order to get something done. And so this is one of the lessons that we get from sort of the media archaeology school, that the past is never past. It's always like sedimented and can blow up into the present in particular circumstances. And that's a very kind of difficult thing to think through. You know, how to make that argument without being kind of what anthropologists kind of hate, the thrust in media studies that is towards what they would call a kind of technological determinism. And so that balancing act is a very difficult one to do. In terms of turning points, I mean, I'd be curious to think about, like, do you have particular turning points in mind? Because people talk about turning points all the time that aren't turning points, because they want to sound profound and like, oh, something really important happened that actually no one cares, or they cared for a day and then the next day something else. And so turning points, the profundity of which you usually only understand well after the fact, like Gilles Van Renie, like the French Revolution, right? I'm sure people knew they were doing something very important, but the world historical scale of it becomes constructed much later through Hegel and Marx and other thinkers. The turning point is a claim that many people make, like the event. And the question is, what kind of rhetorical power does that have? And does it actually point to something of any importance at all? Especially when you're looking at political commentary, where people like to just make it sound like something important is happening, because that's their job. In terms of the curtailment and the question of censorship of these two different events, it's kind of interesting to juxtapose them. I'm not going to prescribe what the state should do in these events. One of the effects of the BBC documentary, and the one thing that I do look at often, is the degree to which an act of repression becomes itself something that draws attention to the thing that's being repressed. And I think many people who wanted to see the BBC documentary, at least the first one, saw it. Perhaps it wasn't projected in the ways that they wanted to do it, and so forth. And so in that case, the state repression, of course, did a lot to delegitimize it in the eyes of people who were sympathetic to the state in some respects. But I don't know that it necessarily actually curtailed people's capacity to watch it. That's an empirical question that I don't have an answer to. In terms of the Trump arrest or arraignment, an interesting news item today was that some news stations, I think NPR, the National Public Radio, and a few others who are on the more liberal end of US politics, have realized the degree to which the inflammatory images that Trump wants out there of him in handcuffs with a mugshot and stuff, all the stuff that was denied to him by the when the event actually happened, went out of their way not to report it in very graphic terms, but to report it as a rather mundane story, precisely in order to treat this as what it is from a legal perspective, right? In all these, like, we can look at the same as what's happening right now with the defamation case against Rahul Gandhi, right? It gets so difficult to disentangle the legal aspects from the media aspects and the political aspects. But we're at a law school here. The law should have an independent logic of its own, and the news should be responsible to that as well as just the political ramifications. And I think some of what we're seeing in the more responsible reporting on Trump is precisely to downplay the political aspects in order to look at the law, which is what the prosecutor would like people to do. And therefore, Trump is a citizen like everyone else. And it might be historically the fact that he's the first president to have been arraigned in this manner. But the fact is many other people before him have, before the eyes of the law. And so I think some of what responsible reporting means here is precisely to focus on issues that are less spectacular. And of course, we see very little of that in a lot of news media because that doesn't sell. And but I think that's an important aspect of. So I'm not going to get into the state's role so much as what would the kind of media ethics question.
One more.
There's a hand up over there.
Thank you so much, Frank. That was really interesting conversation. And I think I'm old enough and close to Tamil Nadu politics enough to remember pretty much most of these media events that Larry just listed out. I remember my father crying in front of the TV when he saw Karnataka taken away. So, but one thing that I was curious, and another event that I thought might have been very important, but then Frank mentioned it, and I'm sorry if it's there and I just mentioned it, is the tsunami.
Yes.
So that's 2005, and that is, again, natural disasters
Yes.
are, again, whether how much natural they are or not is a different question, is also something that heavily relies on eventness in the media to carry images across.
Yeah.
And both evoke a certain kind of imagery, very particularly even if it's whether it's donor organizations or the state, what they're doing, rehabilitation, the whole sort of shebang that comes along with an event like tsunami. And that also in living memory is how people relate, at least in some places like Pondicherry and Vedankani and all.
Yes.
It's a pre-tsunami, post-tsunami life.
Yeah.
It's very similar in sense to the way that we relate to COVID.
Yes.
That is also a disaster.
Yes.
Again, I wouldn't unproblematically or uncritically label it as a
Sure.
natural disaster. But again, relies very heavily on being an event. Some bit of it is created event, some bit again in natural terms, and again relies on media. So is there? I'm sorry that it's already mentioned.
It's not, no.
I did
No.
find a reference to that. So is there a reason why that was excluded as not being in your conceptions that not an event and therefore not there? Or is it that you were tracing political discourses? In which case, are we then again making the division between natural disasters and apolitical events? Because I know you're restricting yourself to Tamil Nadu, so there are lots of other disasters that have the same imagery and the same memory. Another one that I remember coming up. So just a quick response to what I'm surprised to not see that.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating work. When you were discussing this Karunanidhi's arrest episode, you mentioned sort of the phrase claims to sovereignty. That just struck me.
Yes.
Because I think somewhere here there's the assumption that this form of militarized politics involves spectacles and non-spectacles of sovereignty. And I was wondering how you account for banality, cynicism, humor, that it's a fairly sophisticated political culture where people practice a pragmatic detachment. This is just politics. This is all drama. And I think the question this boils down to is that while the concept of the news event is interesting and generative, where do you think it encounters its own limits?
I had a question going back to Robin Jeffrey's book on the newspaper revolution, when he's looking at 1978 or 1977. And I worked on a repository of newspapers that begins in 1978. And in his book, it is in the section of advertising that he has it's on the chapter of advertising, I think, which has a section of the main event. And I was thinking about the advertisement, which has been such an integral part of newspapers and of course our media now, and how that might inflect this sort of collapsing of distinction between news and the way it is suppressed. Because advertising, when I look at the newspapers, they become the event that they are advertising. And that is also something that I think editors of small newspapers also do, that the editorial becomes the event around which action can also be mobilized. But the way in which advertisements project themselves, draw an audience, also seems to be part of the event creation. They can be quite elaborate, they happen over several days. So I was wondering if there's something about the advertisement that can tell us something about how news itself is being.
So this was a question regarding your mention of law and legal reporting. So you mentioned that usually courts kind of don't allow as much intrusion into the court space because of maintaining the match system and all of that. But now we see like the Supreme Court has opened up live streaming of at least constitutional law cases. And I don't think the day is far when just like you have broadcast news channels, broadcasting Lok Sabha proceedings, also maybe broadcasting on live TV, let's say the pronouncement of a judgment in an important constitutional law case, if the court chooses to decide that. So how do you see that kind of impacting law and politics and legal reporting project?
Also, live law tweets.
Yeah.
And also like we have live meetings, for instance, often we in classes, instead of the lecture are following the live tweets of live law to see what's happening in an important case we're following.
Okay, thanks. Another amazing set of questions. So the tsunami is not actually featured in the book, not by design to exclude it. The book does tend to focus on events that are kind of stereotypically political or legal, because I happen to spend a lot of time in the High Court press room. The question of the disaster is a really important one in thinking about event-driven reporting, and I'm glad you posed it. One of the things that isn't in the book, but has been very important in discussions I've had with people about questions of the event, and the tsunami in particular, is the way in which the geography of Chennai was reimagined very quickly through not only news reporting on responses, but also other forms of circulation of misinformation. And I'm thinking in particular of the fishing community, that suddenly an important part of the city, a set of people suddenly became visible in a way that they hadn't been before. And they have maintained a certain visibility, and as you say, there's pre and post, in a very kind of striking way that people's understanding of the city changed. Another aspect is the geography of the city. People suddenly woke up to the fact that T Nagar was built on a lake. People didn't really think about that before, I think. I mean, people in T Nagar must be aware that yes, it's from the Chennai Plaza. People started to look at old maps. And actually, that was the lake. Nungambakam, it was a tank. So that is an incredible event that truly, talk about a turning point. That I would accept as a very good way of characterizing tsunami and its effect on the public imagination of Chennai. And it escapes this book, perhaps because it is more of an event with a big E, in the sense of like, it is a turning point, and it is an event of tremendous political importance that, in a sense, didn't fit within the kind of scope that I had developed over the course of the research. And so while I have tons of material on it, I think it raises a whole set of questions that this book is not equipped to answer very well. So thank you for posing that. In terms of the sort of the limits of focusing on spectacle and the question of cynicism and kind of the knowing public, I think it's important to kind of gauge events in which people are generally pretty cynical, and then those in which, and often taking to the streets is a measure, but sometimes you're cynical about people taking to the streets because it's very well orchestrated, and so that's always a question. And so that's a question that kind of floats through the book, especially around the question of a crowd. So is it a real crowd, or is it a crowd that people have just called out? And the question of instrumentality, Did they write that article just because they wanted a crowd to come out and hit them? Nakiran is well known for that. And so cynicism actually plays a fairly large role in the book. One of the things that's amazing is people still care about the news. And so the tools of cynicism are very high. There is still a degree of faith. And I guess cynicism and faith are kind of, they're twinned, is something that we've learned in thinking about the anthropology of crowds and publics, that you can't have one without the other. And so I think it's an important dimension of how the news event unfolds and how it gets interpreted. Advertisements. One of the things I learned doing this research on newspapers in particular, and I think the question changes when you shift media a little bit, is the degree to which government advertisement is so essential. It's become more so than when I was starting this research. Government advertising is the bread and butter of so much of the newspaper industry, which is why a lot of people don't report on a lot of bad things that happen, because you don't want to have the government ads pulled. And so there's a history of pulling government ads. That goes back to the DMK, was perfected by the ADMK, that determined who was willing to report on what. And of course, now we see the current central government very effectively using advertising in order to, and so, people have become quite cynical about that. In terms of advertising as part of the event creation, are you thinking about advertising for the newspaper or advertising in the newspaper? I guess is one, I'm not completely clear, because newspaper ads and broadsheets being put up in street corners become very important events in their own right sometimes, but yeah.
I was thinking advertising as a method to learn from how the news circulates.
Yeah.
As the advertisement collapses that distinction between what it is trying to convey and.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I guess I have to think more about that, because I've often thought of advertisement as a kind of a power lever, right? Which is why Times of India is never going to report on some things, because they're, as the owner says, we're in the advertising business, not the news business. But in terms of the advertisement as that place where the representation of the event are totally collapsed, I think I've learned a lot from the kind of literature that looks at advertising analytically, and thinking about advertising as a craft and how it builds kind of an environment. And of course, advertising as a logic has pervaded our politics the world around. And so political campaigns are thought of as advertising campaigns. And so news events become part of this broader approach to what I call in the conclusion of the book, environmental engineering, where you're trying to create an environment in which favorable events are likely to occur, which is different than staging an event. I think parties, as they get deeper into the logic of advertising, get more savvy about that aspect of it. I don't know if that answers the question. The entry of TV into the courtroom and the live tweet. So the live tweet, that already breaks down a certain barrier that was there. The television entry is going to be a very important shift. It just entered into the assembly for the first time recently in Tamil Nadu, and the chief minister made great use of it in his battle with the governor. It will definitely change people's relationship to the courtroom, and not always for the better. I mean, the people in this line of work usually point to O.J. Simpson trial as kind of a big moment in American, public culture around law. I would point to another moment, which we haven't mentioned yet, which was the first press conference that was held outside the Supreme Court, breaking that wall by the justices, discussing malfeasance inside the court. And we have versions of that in Tamil Nadu. Those are moments of breakdown that really shifts terms in very important ways. And I do think the entry of television into the courts will be a pretty decisive moment where judges, suddenly you have it verbatim. And so a lot of the stuff I write about in the book is where the newspaper might quote a judge and the judge say that. But now you have a form of evidence that is going to change how judges think about their own publicity.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you so much. This is
Thank you, Karthik. Thank you, everyone.
This is the best possible audience in which to launch it. Thanks.
So order is spoken.
Yeah.
It's not available yet.
It's not available yet.
It's only from Chicago, but I'm sure a PDF is floating around already.
No, it is not.
It's not?
That's not a question.
You select when your pen has a mid.
Based on the research, the media relation has actually improved popular
Very
society
quickly,
because
hello.
if I observe the recent
But that's good. It's
traditional media space and also the recent plus media
you,
spaces,
me,
what I'm seeing is constant focus on the short-lived events
Yes.
and variant,
students,
which basically try to
friends.
optimize on people's smaller attention
Yeah.
spans and then